The voicemail came on a Sunday morning, 3 days after I buried Dorothy. I was standing in the kitchen in the same clothes I'd worn to the funeral, holding a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, watching the birds fight over the feeder she used to refill every Saturday without fail. My phone was on the counter. I almost didn't pick it up. "Dad." My son Garrett's voice. Flat, businesslike. The way he'd sounded ever since he married Renee 6 years ago. "I've already spoken with the estate attorney. There's a meeting Wednesday at 10. You don't need to be there. Renee and I will handle everything. You've got enough to deal with." I played it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there until the coffee went completely cold. 67 years old, 41 years married to the same woman, 32 years driving the same delivery route for the same freight company before my knees gave out and I retired. I wasn't a complicated man. I didn't need a lot. But standing in that kitchen, in that silence, I needed someone to tell me that the life Dorothy and I had built together still meant something. That I still meant something. My phone buzzed. A text this time, from Garrett. "Renee and I have already consulted with a financial advisor. Mom's estate is more complex than you realize. We're better equipped to manage this. Trust us. Trust us." The 2 words sat in my stomach like gravel. I walked to the hallway and looked at the row of photographs Dorothy had arranged on the wall over 30 years. Our wedding, 1984, outside a little Baptist church in Macon, Georgia. Dorothy, in a dress, her mother sewed by hand. Me, in a borrowed tie that was 2 inches too short. Garrett's first day of kindergarten, his backpack bigger than he was, his hand in mine. Our trip to the Smoky Mountains the summer Garrett turned 12, the 3 of us standing at an overlook, squinting into the sun. I remembered every single one of those days. I remembered who had paid for every single one of them, too. I went to the refrigerator and found it full of casseroles from the neighbors. The Hendersons across the street had left a lasagna. The Tran family from 2 doors down had left something with rice that smelled incredible. Nobody had asked whether I could cook. I'd been cooking my own breakfast since I was 9 years old. But people assumed things about a man my age living alone. My phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Caulfield?" A woman's voice, professional, measured. "My name is Patricia Owens. I'm an attorney with Owens & Bright. I handled your wife's estate planning for the past 2 years. I know this is a very difficult time, but there are elements of Dorothy's will that require your presence at Wednesday's reading. Not optional presence. Required." I gripped the phone tighter. My son told me I didn't need to be there. A pause. "Your son was not the client, Mr. Caulfield. Dorothy was. And Dorothy was very specific about who needed to be in that room." Another pause. Shorter. "She was also very specific about what would happen if certain people decided to show up without you." I didn't sleep well that night. Or the next. I lay in the bed Dorothy and I had shared since 1991, on my side, not moving toward the center the way I'd learned not to during her illness, still keeping to my half out of habit, out of love, out of something I didn't have a name for yet. I thought about the last year. Dorothy's diagnosis had come 18 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor had been kind but direct. "We had time," he said, "but not unlimited time." Dorothy had taken the news with the same calm practicality she brought to everything. She'd squeezed my hand in the car on the way home and said, "Well, we've got some things to organize then." Looking back, I understood now that she'd meant more by that than I realized. In those final months, I'd noticed things. Calls she ended when I walked into the room. Folders she tucked away when I came downstairs. A meeting with Patricia Owens that she'd attended alone, brushing off my offer to drive her by saying she could manage perfectly well and that I should stay home and watch the game. I hadn't thought much of it then. Dorothy had always been independent. She didn't need me hovering. But she'd also started asking me strange questions. When did we buy the house? What year did we open the joint savings account? Did I still have the original deed to the property in the lockbox? At the time, I thought the illness was affecting her memory. Now I wondered if she'd been building a record, documenting something. I was sitting at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning with my second cup of coffee when I remembered the day Garrett had brought Renee to Sunday dinner for the first time. That was 7 years ago. Renee was polished, sharp-edged, the kind of woman who calculated the trajectory of a conversation 3 sentences before it arrived. She worked in commercial real estate in Atlanta. Within 20 minutes of sitting down at our table, she'd complimented our neighborhood while making it clear she found it unremarkable. praised Dorothy's pot roast while suggesting a different cut of beef would have been more tender, and asked me, with a smile so practiced it looked painted on, whether I'd given any thought to my retirement portfolio. I was still working then. I told her so. Of course, she'd said, but freight driving isn't exactly the kind of career that builds long-term wealth. Garrett tells me you two have been pretty much paycheck to paycheck most of your marriage. She'd said it lightly, the way people say things they want to land hard, not a criticism. Just something to think about in terms of estate planning. Dorothy had set down her fork very quietly. She hadn't said anything, but later that night, after Garrett and Renee had gone, she'd sat with me at the kitchen table and said, "I don't like that woman." I'd told her to give Renee a chance. People could be nervous meeting their partner's parents. I'd told her Garrett seemed happy. Dorothy had looked at me for a long moment. "Garrett seems managed," she'd said finally. "There's a difference." She'd been right. I understood that now. Wednesday morning, I put on my good slacks and the blue button-down Dorothy had picked out for my last birthday. I drove downtown to the offices of Owens & Bright, which occupied the second floor of a converted brick building that had probably been a warehouse once. Patricia Owens met me in the lobby. She was around 60, with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where people tried to intimidate each other. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Caulfield. There are a few things I need to prepare you for before we go in." She walked me to a small conference room off the main hallway, separate from the larger one where, presumably, Garrett and Renee were already waiting. "Your son and his wife arrived 40 minutes early. They've already asked my assistant twice about the anticipated duration of the meeting and whether the property deed would be transferred today." The property deed. The house Dorothy and I had saved for 11 years to buy. Scrimping on everything, driving cars until the wheels were nearly falling off, taking vacations exactly twice in that entire stretch. That house. What exactly did Dorothy plan? I asked. Patricia folded her hands on the table. "Your wife came to see me 9 times in the 14 months before she passed. She was meticulous. She asked the right questions, she did her own research between appointments, and she made decisions that were, in my professional opinion, strategically sophisticated and emotionally precise." She paused. "She also told me things about your family situation that gave her plan a very specific shape." "What kind of things?" She'd overheard conversations between Garrett and Renee that concerned her deeply. Conversations about what they expected to receive after her death. About their belief that you wouldn't be in a position to contest their decisions. About the assumption that you were, her word, manageable. The word hit me somewhere behind the sternum. Manageable. She also discovered something about Renee's financial history that she felt you needed to know. But she wanted you to hear it in a particular way, at a particular moment. Patricia stood. "I think it's time to go in." The main conference room had tall windows and the kind of heavy wooden furniture that was meant to communicate permanence and authority. Garrett sat on one side of the long table, Renee beside him. They were both dressed sharply, Garrett in a blazer, Renee in a charcoal jacket with a silk blouse. They looked like people who'd come to close a business deal. Garrett glanced up when I walked in. Something moved across his face, surprise, then a quick recalibration. "Dad, you didn't have to make the drive. This is my wife's will reading," I said, and I sat down directly across from him. Renee gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. We're glad you're here, Walter. This is a lot to handle. We just didn't want you to feel overwhelmed." "I feel fine," I said. Patricia took her place at the head of the table and opened a thick folder. Renee had a notepad in front of her. Garrett had his phone. They looked ready. Confident. Like people who already knew the ending of a story and were just waiting politely for it to be read aloud. Patricia began with the standard legal language, the formal declarations and witnessing statements, and I watched Renee's pen tap lightly against her notepad in a rhythm that suggested barely contained impatience. Garrett kept his face arranged into an expression of somber respect, but his eyes had the focused look of a man watching a scoreboard. "To my son, Garrett Allen Caulfield," Patricia read, "I leave my father's pocket watch, the complete collection of family photographs currently stored in the cedar chest in the upstairs bedroom, and my sincere gratitude for the years he made his mother proud, particularly the years before he forgot who he was." Garrett's expression flickered. Renee's pen stopped tapping. "To my daughter-in-law, Renee Caulfield, I leave my hope that she will someday value what cannot be bought, and my forgiveness for the things she said when she thought no one important was listening. The room went very quiet. To my husband, Walter James Caulfield, who has been my home for 41 years, Renee leaned forward almost imperceptibly. I leave the entirety of my estate, including our family home at 4417 Birchwood Lane, all joint and individual savings accounts, my life insurance proceeds, and all other assets held in my name, without condition, without restriction, and without apology. Garrett's composure cracked. That's not... He stopped himself, started again. That can't be the complete document. I'm not finished, Patricia said, and her voice carried the specific patience of someone who has been preparing for exactly this reaction. There is a secondary provision. She turned a page. Should any party attempt to contest this will, challenge my mental competency, or initiate any legal action regarding the distribution of my estate, the following additional materials will be submitted to the court as evidence of my full understanding of the circumstances surrounding this bequest. She reached into the folder and produced a sealed envelope, cream-colored. Dorothy's handwriting on the front. To be opened only in the event of a challenge. Renee's hand moved to Garrett's arm. A warning gesture. I saw it clearly. We're not going to contest anything, Renee said quickly. Her voice had changed, the warm social polish gone, something harder underneath. We just want to understand the reasoning. The reasoning is stated in a personal letter Dorothy left for Walter, Patricia said, which I'll give him privately. Is there anything else you'd like addressed before I conclude the reading? Garrett looked at me across the table, and for a moment I saw my son, my actual son, somewhere behind the composed, Renee, managed surface. I saw the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on long drives, who'd cried at his grandfather's funeral, who'd called me from his first apartment at midnight because he couldn't figure out how to unclog the sink and was too embarrassed to admit it. That boy was still in there somewhere, Dad, he said, and his voice was lower, less certain. We were just trying to help. Renee has experience with estate management, with protecting assets. We thought, what assets were you protecting them from? I asked quietly. From me? He didn't answer. Patricia walked me to her private office afterward. It was smaller than the conference room, lined with books, a fern in the corner that looked like it had been there since the building was a warehouse. She poured us both a glass of water and handed me Dorothy's letter. It was 3 pages, front and back, in Dorothy's careful schoolteacher handwriting, the kind of handwriting that came from 30 years of writing on whiteboards so students in the back row could read it. My darling Walter, if you're reading this in Patricia's office, then the meeting went the way I expected it to. I'm sorry you had to sit through that. I tried to arrange things so that Garrett would understand immediately that his assumptions were wrong. Whether Renee lets him understand is another matter. I need to tell you some things I should have told you while I was alive. I was afraid of what would happen to our family if I did. I see now that I was really just afraid of being the one to break it. That wasn't fair to you. 14 months ago, 3 weeks after my diagnosis, I overheard a conversation between Garrett and Renee in the kitchen while I was resting upstairs. They didn't know I was home. I had come back early from a doctor's appointment and hadn't announced myself. I had to stop and take a breath. Renee was talking about the house. She said, and I am quoting this as exactly as I can remember, once Dorothy is gone, Walter won't have a clue what anything is worth. We can have him sign whatever we put in front of him. Garrett didn't agree with her. I want you to know that. He told her to stop. But he didn't tell her she was wrong. He didn't defend you. He just told her it wasn't the right time to discuss it. That was when I understood that your son was not a bad man. He was a weak one. And Renee had spent 6 years making him weaker. There is more, Walter. There is something about Renee that I discovered 4 months ago. Something that made me understand why she married Garrett with such intention. My hands were not steady when I turned the page. Renee was previously married. Did Garrett ever tell you that? She was married for 3 years to a man named Douglas Heller in Savannah. Douglas Heller died of a heart attack 18 months into their marriage. He was 71. Renee was 34. She inherited his house, his savings, and a life insurance policy. She sold everything within a year and relocated to Atlanta, where she met Garrett. I'm not saying she did anything wrong in her first marriage, Walter. I hired a private investigator and she was thorough, and there was nothing criminal to find. But the pattern troubled me. A significantly older man with assets. A young wife who positioned herself as a financial manager early in the relationship. Assets transferred efficiently after his death. Garrett is not old. But you are. And we have a house and a savings account that, to someone like Renee, must look like an opportunity. I put the letter down and looked at the fern in the corner for a long time. Dorothy had been lying in bed fighting cancer, and she had hired a private investigator to protect me. She had spent her remaining energy on this, on making sure I would be safe after she was gone. I picked the letter back up. I don't tell you this to hurt Garrett. I tell you because you need to know what you're dealing with, and because I have arranged things so that you will never have to fight her directly. The will is structured the way it is because I want there to be nothing to fight over, nothing for her to manage, maneuver, or slowly transfer. Everything goes to you, cleanly and without condition. And Patricia has copies of everything my investigator found, to be used only if Renee decides to push back legally. But here is what I really want to say, and I want you to read this part carefully. Garrett is not lost. He has just been very far from himself for a very long time. He needs you. Walter. He needs his father. Not a fight, not an ultimatum. Just his father, steady and present, the way you've always been. You have spent 41 years being the quietest kind of strong, the kind that doesn't ask for applause. You worked overtime so we could take Garrett to Disney World the year he turned 9. You fixed everything in that house with your own hands and never once suggested we call a repairman because you wanted to save the money. You sat with me through every single infusion without complaint, without falling apart, even though I know you were terrified. You brought me tea, and you held my hand, and you told me bad jokes until I laughed. That is not weakness, my love. That is the most durable thing I have ever known. Take care of our son. And please, please take care of yourself. All my love across whatever distance. Dorothy. I sat with that letter for a long time. Patricia didn't rush me. When I finally came out, she told me Garrett and Renee had left 15 minutes earlier. Renee had wanted to speak with Patricia privately. Patricia had declined. I imagined Renee in the elevator, recalibrating, already mapping a new approach. I imagined Garrett beside her, quieter than she was, rearranging what he thought he knew. I drove home the long way, past the freight depot where I'd worked for 3 decades, past the elementary school where Dorothy had taught 4th grade for 22 years. I stopped at the cemetery and sat with her for a while. I didn't talk out loud. I just sat. 3 weeks passed. Garrett called once, 4 days after the will reading. The conversation was short and careful, both of us moving around the real things, like furniture in a dark room. He said he hoped I was doing all right. I said I was. He said the will had been a surprise. I said his mother had always been full of surprises. There was a long pause, and then he said he needed to think about some things, and I said I understood, and we hung up. I learned to cook 3 new things that month. Dorothy's chicken soup from her handwritten recipe card, which I'd found tucked inside a cookbook with a note that said, "For Walter for the winter." A pot roast that took 4 hours but filled the house with a smell that made it feel less empty. Cornbread, because I'd always meant to learn, and never had. The house settled around me. I repaired the gutter, on the north side, that had been pulling loose since October. I sorted through Dorothy's things slowly, one drawer at a time, keeping what felt too important to release, donating what I knew she'd want to go somewhere useful. I found a shoebox on the top shelf of her closet that was filled with notes. Notes I'd written her over 41 years, birthday cards, notes slipped into her work bag, notes left on the kitchen counter when I'd gotten home from a late route. I'd forgotten most of them. She'd kept every single one. I was reading through them on a Saturday afternoon when my phone rang. Garrett, "Dad, could I come over?" He came alone. Renee was visiting her mother in Savannah, he said, and I did not ask follow-up questions. He sat at the kitchen table in jeans and a flannel shirt, and he looked like he was 30 again, like the version of himself that existed before 6 years of Renee's particular gravity had pulled him into a different orbit. I made coffee. I put the cornbread I'd made that morning on the table between us. "Patricia Owens called me," he said. "She told me Mom had left a secondary letter. For me, she wanted me to have it after things settled down." He reached into his jacket pocket and put an envelope on the table. It was already open, Dorothy's handwriting on the front. "For Garrett when he's ready." I didn't ask what it said. He told me anyway. She said she wasn't angry at me. His voice was unsteady. She said she knew I wasn't a bad person. She said she'd watched me disappear into someone else's idea of who I should be, and that she blamed herself partly because she hadn't said anything soon enough. He stopped, pressed his fingers against his eyes. "She said you never stopped being proud of me, even when I gave you about 100 reasons not to be." I didn't say anything. I let it sit there. Dad, what Renee said that day in the kitchen. The thing about Mom signing whatever we put in front of you. He shook his head. I should have stopped her. I should have said something then. She has a way of making things sound reasonable, like she's just being practical. And I got so used to believing her version of everything that I stopped checking it against my own. He looked up. I stopped checking it against you. I know, I said. I'm sorry. The word was simple. It landed, simply. I put my hand on the table between us and he put his hand on top of mine, the way he used to when he was small and we were crossing a street, and we sat like that for a minute. How's the cornbread? I asked. He looked at the plate like he'd forgotten it was there. He took a piece, chewed. Better than Mom's, honestly. Don't say that out loud, I said. She can probably still hear us. He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh in what felt like years. I won't tell you that everything resolved neatly after that. Garrett and Renee are still married. I don't know what happens inside that marriage, and I've stopped trying to see through its walls. What I know is that Garrett calls me twice a week now. He came over 3 Sundays in a row to help me replace the back fence, which we'd been meaning to do since the storm 2 years ago took out 2 posts. He brought lunch both times, sandwiches from the deli he remembered I liked, the kind with the pickles and the extra mustard. Renee came once, about 2 months later. She sat in the living room and made polite conversation, and did not look comfortable doing it. She did not bring up the will, or the estate, or financial planning. When she left, she hugged me briefly and said the house was lovely and she hoped I was taking care of myself. I thanked her and said I was. I found out through Garrett, mentioned in passing, that she had ended her business partnership with a property investor she'd been working with for years. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. I understood what Dorothy had arranged well enough to know that certain information had a way of reaching people who needed to see it. The investigator's file had never needed to go to court. It just needed to exist. I go to the cemetery every Sunday morning. I bring coffee in 2 travel mugs and I sit on the bench near Dorothy's grave, and I drink them both because I've never been able to break the habit of making 2 cups. I tell her things, how the roses she planted along the south fence are coming back strong this spring, how Garrett fixed the kitchen faucet last weekend by himself, and how proud he looked when the dripping stopped, how I finally watched that documentary series she'd had bookmarked for 3 years, and she was right, it was excellent, and I finished all 6 episodes in 4 days. I tell her, I'm all right. Most days that is true. What she gave me was not just a house or a savings account or a legal victory over someone who had miscalculated who I was. What she gave me was the evidence that she had seen me clearly for 41 years, and that what she saw was worth protecting. I am not a man who built his life on grand gestures or impressive numbers. I drove the same route for 32 years. I fixed things with my own hands. I made 2 cups of coffee every morning, and I meant it as an act of love each time. Dorothy knew that. She collected the evidence of it across 4 decades, and she sealed it up and she made sure it would survive her. That is the inheritance she left me. Not the house, though I'm grateful for it. Not the savings, though they matter. The inheritance she left me was the proof, clear and documented and legally protected, that a quiet man who loves his family well is not manageable, is not forgettable, is not nothing. Now I want to hear from you, friends. Have you ever had someone in your corner, protecting you in ways you didn't know, until it was almost too late? Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And before you go, I've left 2 more stories on the end screen that I think you're going to want to watch. Thank you for staying with me until the end. The quietest love is often the most durable. Walter never demanded recognition, never made speeches, never kept score. He just showed up, decade after decade, in small and steady ways. If someone in your life loves you like that, notice it before you need a letter to remind you. And if you are that person, the one who fixes the fence, makes the extra cup, stays without being asked, know that you are someone's greatest inheritance. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, written to bring you a moment of entertainment and, hopefully, leave something warm and useful in your heart.